The night my son Jason called me a burden in front of a house full of guests, I didn't cry. I didn't defend myself. I simply smiled, reached for the pen beside the catering invoice, and signed one document. Everyone thought I was too humiliated to speak. Jason thought he had finally put me in my place, but that quiet signature didn't break me. It changed everything he thought he owned, including me, Ani. If you've ever been underestimated in your own family, I'd love to hear your story. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. And if this moment already speaks to you, please subscribe and share your thoughts below. Sometimes silence carries the loudest truth. My name is Sarah Myers, and at 67, I had learned how to make myself small without disappearing completely. It's a skill women of my generation often master without even realizing it, how to adjust to accommodate, to smooth over the sharp edges of other people's discomfort, so that life can continue peacefully, or at least appear to. I lived in Columbus, Ohio, in a quiet suburban neighborhood where the lawns were always trimmed and the mailboxes all looked the same. The house I lived in now was larger than anything I had ever needed for myself, with tall windows, polished hardwood floors, and a kitchen that seemed designed more for display than for living. To anyone looking from the outside, it was my son Jason's home. That's how he introduced it. That's how the neighbors knew it. But the truth, like so many truths in families, was more complicated. I had paid for that house. Not entirely at once, not in some grand gesture that would earn applause or gratitude, but slowly, quietly over time. After my husband Robert passed away 8 years earlier, I sold the family home we had built together. It was too large for me. Alone, too full of echoes I wasn't ready to face every night. Jason had just begun to find his footing in real estate back then, full of ambition and confidence, talking about investments and opportunities and how he was finally going to make something of himself. I believed him. More than that, I believed in him. When he came to me with the idea of purchasing a newer, more modern house that could serve both of us, it felt like a solution wrapped in love. He said I wouldn't have to be alone anymore. He said we could support each other. He said family should stay together. What he didn't say was how quickly together would begin to feel like something else. At first, everything seemed warm, almost hopeful. I moved into the guest suite, a comfortable space with its own bathroom and a small sitting area. Jason and his wife Lauren occupied the main part of the house. Lauren was elegant, always well-dressed, with a way of speaking that made even casual sentences sound carefully rehearsed. She worked in marketing and had a talent for presentation, not just in her career, but in life. Their home always looked like it was ready for a magazine shoot, and in the beginning she was kind to me, or at least polite. She would ask if I needed anything. She would compliment the meals I helped prepare. She would even sit with me for a few minutes in the evenings, talking about her day in a tone that suggested connection, even if it never quite reached it. Jason was attentive too, at least for a while. He would check in on me, ask about my medications after my fall, insist I didn't need to worry about anything anymore. "You've done enough, Mom," he told me once, placing a hand on my shoulder. "Let me take care of things now." I wanted to believe that more than anything, but time has a way of revealing what words try to hide. The changes didn't happen all at once. They came in small, almost invisible shifts. A conversation cut short. A door closed more quickly than before, a sigh that lingered just a little too long when I asked a simple question. Lauren stopped sitting with me in the evenings. She began to reorganize parts of the house without mentioning it, moving things that weren't hers to move. My routine, my quiet habits started to feel like inconveniences in a space I was supposed to call home. I remember one morning in particular. I had gone into the kitchen early, as I always did, to make coffee. The sunlight was just beginning to filter through the large windows, casting soft shadows across the marble countertop. It was peaceful until Lauren walked in. She didn't greet me. Instead, she looked at the coffee maker, then at the small plate I had left by the sink the night before. "Sarah," she said, her voice calm but edged with something sharper. "We've talked about keeping the kitchen clean overnight. It just sets a certain tone." I stood there holding my mug, unsure how to respond. "It's just one plate," I said gently. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "It's never just one plate," she replied. Jason said nothing when I mentioned it later. He just rubbed his forehead like I had added another problem to a list he didn't have time to manage. "They're just details, Mom," he said. "Try not to make things harder than they need to be. Harder." That word stayed with me, because I had spent my entire life trying to make things easier for him. I began to notice other things after that. Mail that had already been opened before I saw it. Conversations that stopped when I entered the room. Financial discussions between Jason and Lauren that seemed to circle around phrases like timing equity and long-term planning, always just out of full reach. There were moments, quiet, fleeting ones, when I felt like I was no longer a part of the family, but something adjacent to it, something tolerated, managed. And yet I stayed. Part of it was habit, part of it was hope, and part of it, if I'm honest, was fear. Not fear of being alone, I had lived alone before, but fear of what it would mean to accept that the son I had raised with love and sacrifice no longer saw me the same way. I told myself it was stress. Jason's career wasn't as stable as he liked people to believe. Real estate can be unpredictable, and I knew he carried that pressure heavily. Lauren, too, had her own expectations to meet her own image to maintain. So I adjusted. I made myself smaller. I kept my belongings neatly contained within my suite. I stopped leaving dishes in the sink. I avoided asking questions about their plans, their finances, their future. But no matter how small I made myself, I couldn't ignore one truth that had begun to settle quietly in the back of my mind. This house, the one everyone believed belonged to Jason, was still in more ways than one tied to me. The paperwork reflected that. The financial arrangements, the legal structure. They were not as simple as they appeared. Jason didn't talk about that part. Neither did Lauren. And I didn't bring it up. Not yet. Because something in me, something quiet but persistent, was waiting to understand whether the distance I felt was temporary or something far more permanent. Waiting to see how far things would go. And most of all, waiting for the moment when silence would no longer be the kindest choice I could make. I just didn't know then that that moment would arrive in front of a room full of strangers, with a single word that would change everything: burden. The night of the dinner party began like so many others in that house, carefully staged, quietly tense beneath the surface. By 6 o'clock, the living room was already glowing with soft golden light from the overhead fixtures Lauren had chosen specifically for what she called presentation evenings. Every detail had been arranged to impress: fresh flowers on the dining table, wine glasses polished until they caught the light, and a catered spread that looked too perfect to touch. Jason was in his element. I could hear his voice drifting in from the living room as I stood in the kitchen arranging the last of the appetizers onto a tray. Confident, animated, just a little louder than necessary. He laughed easily, the kind of laugh meant to fill a room and make people feel like they were witnessing success. And that's when I told them, you don't wait for the market. You create the opportunity, he was saying, his tone smooth and practiced. A few guests chuckled appreciatively. I paused for a moment, my hands resting lightly on the edge of the counter, and listened. It had always amazed me how effortlessly Jason could step into that version of himself, the one who seemed completely in control, the one who made people believe in him. I used to feel proud when I heard that voice. That night, I felt something else, something quieter, something heavier. Sarah Lauren's voice cut through my thoughts. I turned to see her standing in the doorway, dressed in a sleek navy dress that fit her perfectly. Her hair was pulled back, her makeup flawless. She looked every bit the hostess she wanted to be. "Can you bring those out now?" she asked, nodding toward the tray. "And try to keep it quick. We're about to move into the next course." "Of course," I said softly. I lifted the tray, steadying it carefully, and walked into the living room. The conversation dimmed just slightly as I entered, not enough to be obvious, but enough that I felt it. A shift, a subtle recalibration of attention. There were 6 guests in total. 2 couples Jason had mentioned earlier, and 1 older gentleman I didn't recognize. He stood near the fireplace, his posture relaxed, but his eyes alert, taking in the room in a way that felt different. Jason glanced at me briefly, then back to his guests. "And this is my mom," he said, almost as an afterthought. "She's been staying with us for a while. staying with us, not living here, not part of the home, just staying. I offered a small smile and nodded politely as I set the tray down on the coffee table. "Nice to meet you," one of the women said kindly. "You too," I replied. I moved quietly after that, refilling glasses, clearing small plates, making sure everything flowed smoothly. It was a role I knew well, supporting from the background, keeping things running without drawing attention. But the longer the evening went on, the more I began to feel like I didn't quite belong in the space I was helping maintain. The conversation shifted gradually, as it often does when people grow comfortable. Business topics gave way to personal ones. Stories about travel turned into complaints about responsibility, about aging parents, about the pressures no one likes to admit out loud. One of the men, a tall, broad-shouldered guest named Mark, leaned back in his chair and sighed. "I swear," he said, shaking his head, "my wife's dad just refuses to downsize, won't even consider assisted living. It's like, how long are we supposed to carry that?" There were murmurs of agreement. "It's not just emotional," another guest added. "It's financial. People don't realize how much it costs to keep supporting someone who won't let go." I felt my chest tighten slightly, but I kept my expression neutral. Lauren crossed her legs elegantly, her tone sympathetic but measured. "It's a delicate situation," she said. "You want to do the right thing, but at some point you have to think about your own future too." Jason chuckled. "Exactly," he said. "There's a difference between helping and, well, being stuck." Something in his voice made me look up. He was smiling, but it wasn't the warm, easy smile he used with clients. It was sharper, edgier, like he was enjoying something just beneath the surface. And honestly, he continued glancing around the room, people don't talk about this enough. The reality is sometimes the hardest part isn't the finances or the logistics. He paused just long enough to draw attention. It's the burden. The word landed heavier than anything else that had been said that evening. For a moment, no one spoke. I felt it before I fully understood it. The shift in the room, the way the air seemed to thicken, the subtle awareness that something had just crossed an invisible line. Jason's gaze moved slowly, deliberately, until it settled on me. And when someone refuses to see that he added his voice quieter now, but unmistakably pointed, it makes everything harder for everyone else. The silence that followed was complete. I stood there, a small plate still in my hand, my fingers suddenly feeling too tight around its edge. There are moments in life when time doesn't exactly stop, but it stretches, expands. Every second becomes something you can feel passing through you. This was one of those moments. No one laughed, no one corrected him. Lauren didn't look at me. She simply took a sip of her wine, her expression composed, as if nothing unusual had happened. Across the room, the older gentleman by the fireplace, Harold Bennett, I would later learn, was watching me. Not Jason, not the others, me. And in his eyes there was something I hadn't seen in a long time. Understanding. I set the plate down carefully on the table. My hands were steady, my breathing even. Inside, something had shifted. Not broken, not shattered, but clarified. I looked at Jason for a long moment. He held my gaze just briefly before looking away. That was all I needed. I turned slightly, my voice calm and measured. "Jason," I said gently, "could you hand me that pen?" He frowned, confused. "The pen," he repeated. "Yes," I said, nodding toward the small stack of papers near the edge of the table, the one next to the invoice. There was a flicker of hesitation in his expression, but he picked it up and handed it to me anyway. "Mom, what are you?" "Thank you," I said, cutting him off softly. Then I looked toward the older gentleman. "Mr. Bennett." I said, my tone polite but steady. "Would you mind passing me the folder Richard left earlier?" For the first time that evening, Jason's expression changed completely. "Richard," he asked sharply. But it was too late. Harold Bennett didn't question me. He simply reached for the folder resting beside him and handed it over. The room watched in silence as I opened it. There's something powerful about stillness, about refusing to rush, refusing to react the way people expect you to. It creates space. It draws attention. It makes people listen even when no words are spoken. I turned to the final page, placed the document flat against the table, and lowered the pen to the paper. For just a moment, I allowed myself to feel it all. The years of sacrifice, the quiet compromises, the slow erosion of respect. The moment I realized I had become something less than what I had always been to him. Then I signed my name, Sarah Myers. The ink flowed smoothly across the page, steady and deliberate. When I finished, I set the pen down exactly where I had found it. No one spoke. Jason stared at the document, his face pale. "Mom, what did you just sign?" he asked, his voice tight. I closed the folder gently and looked up at him. Not with anger, not with hurt, but with something far calmer, something he didn't recognize. "You'll understand soon enough," I said. And for the first time in a very long time, I felt completely certain of one thing: I was no longer the one being carried. The room did not return to normal after that. There are moments that fracture the illusion people work so hard to maintain. And once that fracture appears, no amount of polite conversation can quite seal it again. The laughter that had filled the house earlier now felt forced thinner, like something stretched too far. Jason tried to recover first. "Well," he said with a short, uneasy laugh, glancing at the others, "I guess we're handling paperwork mid-party now. Must be important, right?" No one responded right away. Lauren set her glass down carefully, her movements precise, controlled. I could see the tension in the way her fingers lingered just a second too long on the stem. What exactly was that, Sarah? She asked, her tone light, but her eyes sharp. I met her gaze. "Just something I've been meaning to take care of," I said calmly. That was all I offered. It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't an explanation either. Jason stepped closer to me, lowering his voice, though not enough to keep the others from hearing. "Mom, we don't need to be doing this right now," he said, a hint of irritation creeping through. "If it's about the house or finances, we can talk later." The way he said it, casual, dismissive, told me everything. He still believed those decisions were his to schedule. I folded my hands loosely in front of me. "It is taken care of," I replied. Across the room, Harold Bennett watched the exchange quietly. There was no confusion in his expression anymore, only confirmation. Lauren's smile returned, but this time it was tighter. "Well," she said, turning back to the guests, "I'm sure it's nothing urgent. Why don't we continue?" But the atmosphere had shifted too far for easy recovery. Conversations resumed in fragments, people speaking in lower tones, glancing occasionally in my direction. Dinner ended earlier than planned. By the time the last guest had gathered their coat and offered polite goodbyes, the house felt strangely hollow. The carefully curated warmth had evaporated, leaving something colder behind. I stood near the entryway as the final couple stepped out into the night. "It was lovely meeting you," the woman said, gently, her voice softer than before. "You too," I replied. As the door closed, the silence that followed was absolute. Jason turned to me immediately. "What was that about?" He demanded, his composure finally cracking. "You don't just sign something like that in the middle of a dinner and expect me not to ask questions." Lauren crossed her arms, her posture rigid. "I agree," she said. "It was inappropriate." I looked at both of them, really looked, without softening my perception, without explaining away what I saw. "I handled something that needed to be handled," I said simply. Jason ran a hand through his hair, pacing once across the room. "That's not an answer, Mom. It's the only one I'm giving tonight." His frustration flared. "Why are you being like this?" he asked, his voice rising. "If this has anything to do with the house, it has everything to do with me," I said, cutting him off gently but firmly. The words seemed to stop him. For a moment, he just stared at me as if trying to reconcile the person standing in front of him with the version of me he had grown used to. Lauren stepped in, then her tone shifting to something more measured. "Sarah," she said, "if there are legal decisions being made, especially ones that affect the household, Jason deserves to be informed. Deserves." The word lingered. I tilted my head slightly. "Does he?" I asked quietly. The question hung in the air longer than either of them expected. Neither answered, because neither of them could, at least, not honestly. I didn't press further. There was no need. "Good night," I said instead, turning toward the hallway that led to my suite. Behind me, I heard Jason exhale sharply. "This isn't over," he said. "No," I replied, without turning back. "It isn't." Inside my suite, the world felt different. Quieter, smaller, but also clearer. I closed the door gently and leaned against it for a moment, letting the stillness settle around me. My hands, which had remained steady all evening, finally trembled just slightly, not from fear, from release. There's a certain kind of exhaustion that comes not from physical effort but from carrying something for too long without setting it down. That night, I had set something down, and in doing so, I had picked something else up: control. I moved to the small desk by the window and opened the drawer where I kept my personal documents. Inside, everything was exactly as I had left it, neatly organized, protected. The folder I had signed earlier was no longer there. It was with Richard Collins, now just as we had planned. Richard. I reached for my phone and saw a message waiting. Richard Collins. Everything is finalized. You did exactly what needed to be done. Call me in the morning. I read it twice. Not because I didn't understand it, but because I wanted to feel the weight of it fully. Everything is finalized. That one sentence carried years of preparation, of quiet observation of decisions made carefully and deliberately. I sat down slowly, my gaze drifting to the window. Outside, the neighborhood looked unchanged. The same streetlights, the same quiet rows of houses, the same illusion of stability. But inside this house, everything had shifted. Jason didn't know it yet, not fully. He didn't understand that the document I had signed was not a reaction to his words that night. It wasn't impulsive. It wasn't emotional. It was the conclusion of something that had been building for months. The opened mail, the subtle pressure, the conversations that stopped when I entered the room, the brochures for assisted living that appeared by accident on the kitchen counter, and most of all, the growing realization that I was no longer being treated as a mother, but as a variable in someone else's plan. The trust I had signed into place changed all of that, legally, irrevocably. The house, the one Jason presented as his own, was now protected within a structure he could not access, manipulate, or claim without my explicit consent. Every asset tied to my name was now shielded from pressure, from persuasion, from assumption. And Richard, as trustee, ensured that protection would hold. Jason could no longer build his future on something that wasn't his. Lauren could no longer strategize around decisions that didn't belong to her. And I no longer had to pretend I didn't see what was happening. A soft knock on my door interrupted my thoughts. Mom Jason's voice came through quieter now. I didn't answer immediately. "Can we talk?" he asked. There was something different in his tone, less confident, more uncertain. For a brief moment, I considered opening the door, considered stepping back into the pattern we had followed for so long, explaining smoothing, reassuring. But then I remembered the look in his eyes earlier that evening. Not just the word he had used, the certainty behind it. "I'm tired, Jason," I said through the door. "We'll talk tomorrow." There was a pause. Then more softly, "This isn't like you." I closed my eyes for a moment. "No," I replied, "it isn't." His footsteps lingered for a second outside my door, then faded. When the house was quiet again, I exhaled slowly and leaned back in my chair. For years, I had believed that love meant enduring, that if I stayed patient, stayed kind, stayed present, things would find their way back to what they used to be. But love, without respect, isn't love. And patience, when it allows harm to continue, becomes something else entirely. That night, I didn't stop loving my son. I simply stopped protecting him from the consequences of how he chose to treat me, and the document I signed. It wasn't just a legal form, it was a boundary, one that would hold whether he understood it or not. People often think betrayal arrives like a storm, loud, obvious, impossible to ignore. But in my experience, it comes quietly. It settles into everyday life, disguising itself as concern, as practicality, as what's best for everyone. And by the time you realize what it truly is, it has already woven itself into the structure of your world. Looking back, I can see now that the shift in Jason didn't begin with that dinner. It began months earlier in ways so subtle, I almost convinced myself they didn't matter. It started after my fall. It wasn't serious, just a slip on a wet tile floor in my old condo. A bruised hip, a shaken sense of balance, and a few days of soreness that made everything feel more fragile than it really was. Jason had insisted I move in with him after that. "You shouldn't be alone, Mom," he said, his voice filled with urgency. "What if something worse happens next time?" At the time, it sounded like love, and maybe in some small way it was. But love can exist alongside something else, something more complicated. I remember sitting at the small kitchen table in my condo, the one Robert and I had used for nearly 30 years, as Jason laid out his plan. "You could sell this place," he suggested, gesturing around casually. "The market's good right now, and with that money, we could upgrade, get something bigger, more modern. A place where you'd have your own space but still be close to us." I hesitated. "This is my home," I said softly. He nodded quickly. "I know, and I'm not saying you have to decide right away, but think about it. No stairs, no maintenance, no worries. We take care of everything. That word again. It carried comfort, security, the promise of not having to face the future alone, but it also carried something I couldn't quite name at the time. Pressure. I didn't give him an answer that day. Instead, I called Richard Collins. Richard had been our family attorney for years, steady, thoughtful, and never quick to push me in any direction. When I explained Jason's idea, he listened quietly. "And what do you want, Sarah?" he asked. The question caught me off guard. "I want to be close to my son," I admitted. "And your home?" I looked around my kitchen, the worn edges of the table, the soft light that came through the window every morning, the memories layered into every corner. "I don't want to lose it," I said. Richard was silent for a moment. "Then don't," he replied simply. It wasn't what I expected him to say. "Jason thinks it would make things easier," I added. For whom Richard asked gently. That question stayed with me long after the call ended. In the end, I made a compromise. I kept my condo, but I also helped Jason. He found the house we now lived in, a larger property in a desirable neighborhood, one that stretched just beyond what he could realistically afford on his own. He spoke about it with excitement, about the investment potential, the image it would project, the clients it would attract. "I just need a little support up front," he said. "It'll pay off, I promise." And I believed him. So I contributed, not as a loan, not formally, just help. A mother supporting her son, covering part of the down payment, assisting with renovations, stepping in when unexpected costs arose, quietly, always quietly. At first, Jason was grateful. He thanked me often, checked in on me, made sure I felt comfortable in the new space. Lauren, too, seemed appreciative. She would mention how much easier things were with my support, how we were building something together. But gratitude has a way of fading when it becomes expected. Over time, the tone shifted. Requests became assumptions. Support became obligation. I noticed it in small ways. Jason stopped asking if I could help with certain expenses and started telling me what needed to be covered. Lauren began discussing financial matters in front of me as if I were part of the equation, not a separate person. "The landscaping bill came in higher than expected," she said one afternoon, scrolling through her phone. "We'll need to adjust." I looked up from my book. I asked gently. She smiled, but again it didn't reach her eyes. "Well, it affects the whole household, doesn't it?" The whole household. That phrase became a kind of shield, something used to justify decisions that were never really shared. I began to feel it most in my own space, the guest suite. At first it had been described as my private area, my retreat within the house. But gradually, it started to feel less like a sanctuary and more like a boundary. Lauren would knock before entering, but sometimes only after she had already opened the door. She rearranged things without asking, explaining that she was optimizing the space. "It's just about flow," she said, once moving a chair I had placed by the window. "You'll get used to it." But I didn't, because it wasn't about the chair. It was about control. And Jason, no, he stopped noticing, or perhaps he chose not to. There were evenings when I would sit alone in my suite listening to the muted sounds of their conversations drifting through the walls, laughter that didn't include me, plans that didn't involve me. And yet when something went wrong, a bill, a repair, an unexpected expense, I was suddenly very much part of the household again. "Mom, we might need a little help this month." Jason would say, his tone casual, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, and I would nod. because that's what I had always done. Helped. Supported, given. Until one evening, not long before the dinner party, something changed. I had come into the kitchen earlier than usual and found a stack of papers on the counter. At first I thought nothing of it, just more of Jason's business documents. But then I saw my name. Not handwritten, typed. I picked up the top page. It was a brochure for a memory care facility. My heart skipped. There were notes in the margins, small, neat handwriting that I recognized as Lauren's. Affordable option. Close to downtown, good reviews. I stood there, the paper trembling slightly in my hands. Sarah Lauren's voice came from behind me. I turned slowly. She didn't look surprised to see me holding the document. "Oh," she said lightly, walking over. "That's just something I was researching. You know, just in case. In case of what I asked." Her smile was calm, controlled. "In case we need to start thinking about the future," she replied. The future, it sounded so reasonable, so responsible, and yet something about it felt deeply wrong. I placed the paper back on the counter carefully. "I'm not there yet," I said quietly. Lauren nodded. "Of course not," she said, "but it's always better to be prepared. Prepared." That word echoed in my mind because in that moment I realized something I hadn't fully allowed myself to see before. They weren't just thinking about my future. They were planning around it, and I was no longer part of the conversation. That was the first time I felt it clearly, not just discomfort, not just distance, but something else, something colder, something that made me understand for the first time that what I had given freely might one day be taken without asking. And once that thought takes root, it doesn't go away. It grows, quietly, until it becomes impossible to ignore. The morning after the dinner party felt unnaturally quiet. Sunlight slipped through the tall windows like it always did, soft and golden, touching the edges of the kitchen counters, warming the polished floors. From the outside, nothing had changed. The house still looked like the same carefully curated version of success Jason worked so hard to present. But inside, something fundamental had shifted. I could feel it in the silence. Not the peaceful kind, the kind that settles comfortably around you, but the strained kind stretched thin over unspoken questions and rising tension. I had already been awake for hours. Old habits don't disappear easily. I still rose early, made my coffee, sat by the window in my suite, and let the day begin slowly. But that morning, my mind refused to stay quiet. It kept returning to the look on Jason's face when I signed that document, confusion, then concern. And beneath both of those, something closer to fear. A soft knock came at my door just after 8. "Mom, Jason." I didn't answer immediately. I finished my sip of coffee, set the mug down carefully, and then walked to the door. When I opened it, he was standing there in yesterday's tension hair, slightly disheveled, jaw-tight eyes, searching my face, as if trying to read something that hadn't been there before. "Can we talk now?" he asked. I stepped aside and let him in. He didn't sit right away. Instead, he paced once across the small space, then turned back to me. "What did you sign last night?" he asked, skipping any attempt at pleasantries. I remained calm. "I told you I said something I needed to take care of." "That's not enough," he snapped, frustration rising quickly. "You don't just make legal decisions like that without talking to me first." There it was, the assumption. I folded my hands loosely in front of me. "Why would I need to talk to you first?" I asked quietly. He stared at me, clearly not expecting the question. "Because it affects the house," he said. "It affects all of us." "All of us," I repeated softly. He nodded as if that explained everything. I held his gaze. "Jason," I said, my voice steady. "You made it very clear last night how you see me." His expression shifted just slightly. "That's not what I meant," he said quickly. People were talking, and You were honest," I said gently. "More honest than you've been in a long time." He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "Mom, I was under pressure. That doesn't mean I think of you as a burden." I didn't argue. Instead, I asked, "Then why did it come so easily?" The question landed between us heavier than anything I could have said in anger. For a moment, he had no answer. That silence told me more than any explanation would have. Before he could respond, another voice entered the space. Jason Lauren stood in the doorway, her posture composed, as always, though there was a tension in her shoulders that hadn't been there before. "I thought you might be in here," she said, stepping inside. Her eyes moved briefly to me, then back to him. "Have you asked her?" she said. "I'm trying to," Jason replied, his tone edged with frustration. Lauren turned her full attention to me. "Sarah," she began, her voice calm, almost soothing. "We're not trying to make this difficult. We just need to understand what decisions are being made, especially ones that could impact the household." There it was again. The household. I studied her carefully. "And what decisions have you been making?" I asked quietly that impact me. For the first time, her composure cracked just slightly. "I don't know what you mean," she said. I didn't look away. "The brochures," I said. "The conversations, the planning." Jason frowned. "What brochures?" he asked, turning to her. Lauren's expression tightened. It was nothing she said quickly, just research, general information. For me, I asked. She hesitated. "Well, yes," she admitted, "but only because we care." Care, that word again, dressed in concern, hiding something else beneath it. I nodded slowly. "And the mail," I continued. "The documents that have been opened before I see them?" Jason looked between us, confusion deepening. "Lauren," he said, "I haven't opened anything that wasn't important." She replied, her tone defensive now. "Sometimes things come addressed in ways that are unclear, and you decided for me," I said, finishing her sentence. She crossed her arms. "I was helping," she insisted. "By taking control," I said calmly. Jason stepped forward, trying to regain ground. "Okay, let's just slow down," he said. "This is getting blown out of proportion." I looked at him. "Is it?" He hesitated. We're just trying to manage things," he said. "There's a lot going on financially and otherwise, and we're all under pressure." "Financially?" I repeated. He sighed. "Yes, things have been tight, okay? Deals have fallen through, expenses have piled up. We're doing the best we can." "And your solution," I asked, "was to start planning my future without including me." "That's not fair," Lauren said sharply. "We were trying to be proactive." "At my expense," I replied. "No," Jason said quickly, "not at your expense, just with your situation in mind, my situation." I let that settle for a moment, then I said very quietly, "Do you think I'm incapable of making my own decisions?" Jason froze. "No," he said, "of course not." "Then why were you asking Richard Collins about transfer on death arrangements?" I asked. The effect was immediate. Jason's face went still. Lauren's eyes widened just slightly, but enough. "How do you—" He started, then stopped himself. I didn't answer his question, because I didn't need to. The truth was already there, sitting between us. "You've been planning," I said. "For longer than you're willing to admit." "That's not what this is," Jason said, but his voice had lost its confidence. "Then what is it?" I asked. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. Lauren stepped in again, her tone sharper now. "Even if we were discussing possibilities," she said, "that doesn't justify you making unilateral legal decisions without informing us." I looked at her. "Us," I repeated. "Yes," she said firmly. "This affects us." I held her gaze for a long moment, then I said, "Not anymore." The words were quiet, but they carried weight. Jason stared at me. "What does that mean?" he asked. "It means," I said calmly, "that whatever you thought you could control, you can't." The room fell silent. For the first time since the conversation began, neither of them spoke. Because for the first time, they were no longer certain of where they stood. And uncertainty, especially when it comes to power, is not something people handle well. Jason stepped back slightly, his expression shifting from frustration to something more unsettled. "Mom, what did you do?" he asked. I met his eyes. "I protected myself," I said. "That was all. I didn't explain the trust. I didn't outline the legal structure. I didn't tell them how thoroughly their assumptions had already been dismantled. Not yet. Because understanding doesn't come from being told everything at once. It comes from realization, from seeing piece by piece how the reality you believed in no longer exists. And that process had already begun. They just didn't know how far it would go." After that morning, something invisible but undeniable settled over the house. Jason spoke less, Lauren watched more, and I stopped pretending. There is a quiet kind of power that comes from simply seeing things clearly. Not reacting, not confronting immediately, but observing carefully, deliberately, without the need to soften the truth for someone else's comfort. For the first time since I had moved into that house, I allowed myself to do exactly that. I began with something simple. I called Maggie. Margaret Maggie Turner had been my closest friend for over 30 years. We had met when our children were in elementary school, bonded over school fundraisers, late-night phone calls, and the shared exhaustion of raising families while trying to hold ourselves together. She had a warmth that made people feel safe and a strength that made them tell the truth, whether they meant to or not. When I told her everything about the dinner, about the brochures, about the way things had been changing, she didn't interrupt. She just listened. And when I finished, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Sarah," she said finally, her voice steady, "you already know what this is, don't you?" I closed my eyes for a moment. "Yes," I said quietly. "And you're ready to see it all the way through?" That question mattered more than anything else she could have asked, because seeing the truth is one thing, acting on it is another. "I am," I replied. "Good," she said. "Then we do this carefully. We." That word felt different coming from her. It didn't carry expectation. It carried support. With Maggie's help and Richard's guidance, I began to put quiet protections in place. Nothing dramatic, nothing visible, just boundaries. I secured my documents first. Every piece of financial information, every legal paper, every account detail was organized and stored in a locked file box inside my suite. Richard had already ensured that the most critical documents were handled properly through the trust, but I wanted physical control of everything that remained. Then I did something I never thought I would need to do. I installed cameras. Only in my space, only where I had every legal right to do so. Small, discreet devices placed in corners that wouldn't draw attention, but would record everything that happened when I wasn't there. I didn't do it out of paranoia. I did it because something in me needed to know, needed to see, without doubt whether the unease I felt had substance. Maggie didn't question the decision. If your instincts brought you this far, she said they're not wrong now. So I trusted them, and then I waited. Waiting is harder than people think. It requires restraint, patience, the ability to sit with uncertainty without rushing to resolve it. Days passed. Jason and Lauren moved through the house as they always had, though there was a new tension in their interactions with me. Jason tried in small ways to restore normalcy, asking if I needed anything, making brief attempts at conversation. Lauren, on the other hand, became more controlled, more watchful. There were moments when I would enter a room and find her mid-thought, her expression tightening just slightly before smoothing over into something polite. I said nothing. I continued my routine morning coffee, quiet afternoons, occasional errands. I made myself predictable. And then one Sunday morning, I gave them exactly what they expected. "I'm going to church," I said casually as I passed through the kitchen. Lauren glanced up from her phone. "Oh," she said, "what time will you be back?" "A few hours," I replied. "I might stop by Maggie's afterward." She nodded. "Drive safe." Her tone was light, too light. I left the house at exactly 9 o'clock, but I didn't go far. Instead, I parked my car a few blocks away and waited. There's something surreal about sitting in silence while knowing something may be happening in your absence. Time stretches differently. Every minute feels longer, heavier. I didn't check the cameras right away. I gave it time. Then, after nearly 2 hours, I returned quietly, carefully, and entered through the side door. The house was still. Too still. I didn't announce myself. Instead, I went straight to my suite, closed the door, and sat down at my desk. My hands were steady as I opened the laptop. For a moment, I hesitated. Because once you see something, you can't unsee it. Then I clicked. The footage loaded. At first, there was nothing. Just the empty room, the quiet stillness of a space, waiting. Then, about 30 minutes after I had left, the door opened. Lauren. She stepped inside, her movements cautious but purposeful. Behind her, a man I didn't recognize followed a middle-aged man carrying a small case. And behind him, Another man, younger, holding what looked like a tablet. I felt my chest tighten, but I didn't look away. Lauren closed the door softly behind them. "It's fine," she said in a low voice. "She won't be back for a while." The man with the case nodded. "Let's make this quick," he replied. They moved through my space with an efficiency that made my stomach turn. Drawers opened, closet doors slid back. The younger man took photos of the room of my belongings, of things that had no business being documented without my permission. Lauren stood near the center of the room watching, supervising. "This is the main area," she said. "Bathrooms through there." The man nodded, making notes. "And how soon are you looking to—" "Transition?" he asked. "Transition," the word landed heavily. Lauren exhaled slowly. "That depends," she said. "We're working on getting everything in place. Jason just needs her to sign the medical papers before she gets—" Difficult. I felt something inside me go very still. The man glanced up, and if she refuses, Lauren's expression didn't change. "She won't," she said, "not if it's presented the right way." The room went quiet after that. They continued their work, measuring, noting, photographing, as if I were no longer a person, just a situation to be managed, a problem to be solved. When they finally left, Lauren paused at the door, taking one last look around before closing it behind her. The screen went still again. Silence. I sat there, staring at the frozen image of my own room. For a long time, I didn't move. Because there are moments when reality doesn't just reveal itself, it settles into you, layer by layer, until there is no space left for doubt. This was one of those moments. It wasn't suspicion anymore. It wasn't instinct. It was proof. Clear, undeniable, final. I leaned back slowly in my chair, my hands resting in my lap. They hadn't just been thinking about my future. They had been planning it, without me, around me. And now I understood something with absolute clarity. If I had waited any longer, I would have lost the ability to choose at all. But I hadn't waited. I had already signed the document, and they had no idea what that truly meant. Not yet, but they would, very soon. I didn't confront them that day. That might surprise you. If you had seen what I saw, heard the way Lauren spoke about me as if I were already halfway gone, you might think the natural reaction would be anger. Immediate confrontation, demands for explanation. But anger, when it comes too quickly, can be used against you. And I had already learned that lesson the hard way. So instead, I did what I had been doing all along. I stayed quiet. But this time, my silence wasn't about preserving peace. It was about gathering truth. That afternoon, I went to Maggie's house, as I had mentioned earlier. I needed distance, not just physically, but emotionally. I needed space to let what I had seen settle into something I could act on, rather than something that might overwhelm me. Maggie opened the door before I even knocked. She took one look at my face and didn't ask a single question. "Come in," she said gently. I stepped inside, and the warmth of her home wrapped around me in a way that felt almost unfamiliar after the controlled environment I had been living in. We sat at her kitchen table, the same table where we had shared countless cups of coffee over the years, and I told her everything. Every detail. The cameras, the men, Lauren's words. By the time I finished, Maggie's expression had hardened in a way I had rarely seen before. "That's not concern," she said quietly. "That's planning." "I know," I replied. "And Jason?" she asked. I hesitated. "I don't know how much he knows," I admitted, "but he knows enough." Maggie leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. "They're trying to move you out," she said. "Control your finances. Probably get power of attorney. Once they have that, they can do just about anything." I nodded slowly. "I think so, too." "And the medical papers," she pressed. "I haven't seen them yet," I said. "But from what she said, it sounds like they're preparing to declare me incapable." Maggie's jaw tightened. "Then we don't wait," she said firmly. Her words echoed something that had already begun to form in my mind. We don't wait, because waiting at this point would only give them more time to act. "I've already taken the first step," I said quietly. She looked at me. "The document you signed?" she asked. "Yes." "Good," she said. "Then now we build around that." That evening, I returned home. Nothing looked different. Jason was in the living room scrolling through his phone. Lauren was in the kitchen preparing dinner. The rhythm of the house continued as if nothing had happened, but now I could see it clearly. Every movement, every glance, every carefully chosen word. "Hey, Mom," Jason said as I walked in. "How was church peaceful?" I replied. It wasn't a lie. Peace, I was beginning to realize, doesn't always come from your surroundings. Sometimes it comes from knowing exactly where you stand. Lauren turned toward me, offering a polite smile. "Did you have a good time with Maggie?" she asked. "I did," I said. She nodded, then turned back to the stove. No questions, no suspicion. If anything, she seemed comfortable, as if everything was proceeding exactly as she expected. That thought settled heavily in my chest because it meant one thing. They believed they were still in control. Over the next few days, I paid closer attention, not in a way that would draw notice, but in the small details that often go overlooked. Jason spent more time on his phone stepping outside for calls he didn't take in front of me. When he did speak openly, I caught fragments mentions of delayed payments, clients backing out deals that weren't closing as planned. Lauren, meanwhile, became more organized, more precise. I noticed new folders appearing on the kitchen counter labeled categorized, documents stacked neatly, ready to be presented. One afternoon, while she was out running errands, I passed by the counter and saw one of those folders slightly open. Inside, I caught a glimpse of my name again, typed. Not handwritten. I didn't open it. I didn't need to, because I already knew what it contained. Plans, arrangements, decisions made without me. The confirmation came the following Thursday. I had gone out for a short walk, nothing unusual, just a routine I had started to maintain some sense of independence. When I returned, I heard voices in the living room. Jason and Lauren. Their tones were low, but not quiet enough to be private. "We can't keep waiting," Lauren was saying. "The longer this drags out, the harder it's going to be." "I know," Jason replied, his voice tense, "but we have to do this carefully. If she gets suspicious—" "She already is," Lauren cut in. "Did you see her at dinner?" "That wasn't normal." There was a pause. "I think she's just upset," Jason said, though there was uncertainty in his voice. "Or she's starting to realize," Lauren countered. Silence again. Then Jason sighed. "Look, once we get the medical authorization signed, everything becomes easier," he said. "We can handle the accounts, make decisions without going back and forth." "And the house?" Lauren asked. Another pause. "We'll deal with that," after he said. One step at a time, my breath caught. There it was. Not suspicion, not assumption, confirmation. I stepped back quietly before they could notice me, my heart steady despite the weight of what I had just heard. Medical authorization, control of accounts, the house. Later. They had a plan, and I was the last person meant to know about it. That night, I sat in my suite, the lights dim, the house silent around me. I replayed everything in my mind, the footage, the conversation, the patterns that had been building for months. And for the first time, I allowed myself to feel it fully, not just the betrayal, but the clarity that came with it. Because once the truth is undeniable, something shifts inside you. You stop questioning your instincts. You stop making excuses for other people's behavior. And most importantly, you stop waiting for things to get better on their own. I reached for my phone and called Richard. He answered on the second ring. "Sarah," he said, "I was expecting your call." "I have confirmation," I said, simply. There was a brief pause. "Tell me everything." And I did. When I finished, he exhaled slowly. "That's enough," he said. "More than enough." "What do we do next?" I asked. His answer came without hesitation. "We move forward," he said, "on our terms." I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. "Yes," I said quietly, "on our terms." Because for the first time in a long time, I wasn't reacting to what was happening around me. I was preparing for what would happen next. And this time, I would not be the one caught off guard. The next time I spoke to Jason, I gave him a choice. Not openly, not in a way he could immediately recognize, but the kind of choice that reveals truth whether someone intends it to or not. It happened the following evening. Lauren had gone out to meet a friend, and the house felt unusually still without her presence. Jason was in the living room staring at his laptop, though I could tell from the way his fingers hovered over the keyboard that he wasn't really working. I stood in the doorway for a moment before speaking. "Jason," I said softly. He looked up surprised. "Oh, hey, Mom, I didn't hear you." "I'd like to talk," I said. Something in my tone must have reached him because he closed the laptop slowly and gestured toward the couch. Yeah, of course. I sat across from him, leaving a small space between us. Not physical distance, emotional. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his expression already guarded. "What's on your mind?" he asked. I studied him for a moment. My son. The boy I had once held in my arms, who used to run to me when he was scared, who believed without question that I could make anything better. That memory still lived somewhere inside me, but the man sitting in front of me now, he had learned different things. "I want to understand something," I said calmly. He nodded, cautious. "Okay. Have you been making plans about my future?" I asked, without including me. The question landed gently but directly. Jason blinked, caught off guard. "What do you mean?" he asked. I didn't rush to clarify. I let the silence stretch just long enough to make the question settle. "The brochures," I said. "The conversations. The arrangements." His jaw tightened slightly. "That's not what it looks like," he said quickly. "Then tell me what it is," I replied. He leaned back, exhaling through his nose. "It's just planning," he said. "Thinking ahead. You know how things can change, especially after your fall?" "My fall was minor," I said. "I know," he said quickly, "but it still made us think. About what could happen next." "Us," I repeated softly. He hesitated. "Lauren and I," he clarified. "And did either of you think to ask me what I wanted?" I asked. He looked away for a moment. "We were going to," he said, when I pressed gently. He didn't answer right away. That silence told me everything. I nodded slowly. "Have you discussed medical authorization forms?" I asked next. His head snapped back toward me. "Where is this coming from?" he asked, his voice sharper now. "Answer the question, Jason." He hesitated again. Then reluctantly, "Yes, but that's normal. It's just paperwork so that if something happens, we can make decisions quickly." "For me," I said. "Yes," he replied. "For you." I held his gaze. "And who decides what something happening means?" I asked. His expression faltered. "That's not fair," he said. "We're not trying to take anything from you. We're trying to protect you." Protect. There it was again. The word that sounds like love, but often hides control. "By taking control of my decisions," I asked quietly. "No," he said, frustration rising. "By making sure things don't spiral if you can't handle them yourself." The words came out faster than he intended, and once they were spoken, they couldn't be taken back. I felt something inside me settle, not break, not collapse. Settle, because there it was. Not fear, not concern, but belief. He believed I might not be capable, or worse. He needed me not to be. I leaned back slightly, my voice calm. "And what about the house?" I asked. His eyes flickered. "What about it?" he replied. "Have you been making plans for it as well?" I asked. He hesitated longer this time. "Not exactly," he said. "It's just part of the bigger picture." "What bigger picture?" I pressed. He ran a hand over his face. "Mom, things have been complicated," he said finally. "Financially. More than you realize. I might understand more than you think," I said quietly. He looked at me, searching my face. "Deals have fallen through," he admitted. "Expenses keep coming in. The market's not as stable as it looks, and we've been trying to keep everything afloat." "And how does that involve me?" I asked. He exhaled slowly. Because you're part of the household," he said. "And the house it's an asset." The word landed heavily. Asset, not home, not shared space. Asset. I didn't react outwardly. An asset, I repeated. "Yes," he said, his voice softening slightly as if trying to make it sound less harsh. "I mean, eventually it becomes part of, inheritance, long-term planning eventually," I said. He nodded. "And in the meantime," I asked. He hesitated. "In the meantime, we just need some flexibility," he said. "Some support, just until things stabilize." Support. I almost smiled, because for years that word had meant something very different. "How much support?" I asked. He looked down at his hands. I don't know, he admitted. It depends on how things go. And if things don't improve, I asked. He didn't answer, because we both knew the answer. They would continue, taking, adjusting, planning around me, without me. I let the silence settle one last time. Then I asked the question that mattered most. Jason. I said quietly, if I refused to sign anything medical, financial, anything at all, what would you do? He looked up sharply. That's not a fair question, he said. Why not, I asked. Because it puts me in a position where he stopped himself, where what I pressed, his jaw tightened, where I have to choose between respecting your wishes and dealing with the consequences, he said. And what are those consequences, I asked. He hesitated. Then almost reluctantly, things could fall apart, he said. There it was. Not concern for me. Concern for what I represented, what I supported, what I made possible. I nodded slowly. I see, I said. He leaned forward, his tone shifting again, softer, more persuasive. Mom, he said, I know this isn't easy to talk about, but we're all in this together. If you just work with us, if you trust us, we can figure this out. Trust. The final word. The one that tied everything together. I looked at him. Really looked. And for a moment I saw both versions of him. The boy who had once trusted me completely, and the man who now asked for that same trust, while quietly preparing to take control if I didn't give it freely. I do trust you, I said softly. Relief flickered across his face, but then I continued. I trust that you're telling me exactly who you are right now. The relief disappeared. Confusion replaced it. What does that mean, he asked. It means, I said, standing slowly, that I understand more than you think. Mom, I'm tired, I said gently. We can talk more another time. He watched me, uncertainty creeping into his expression. Are we okay? He asked. I paused. There are questions that don't have simple answers, and there are moments when the truth spoken too soon changes nothing. We will be, I said finally. It wasn't a promise, it was a possibility, and as I walked away, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I had given him the chance to tell the truth, and he had chosen not to. From that point on, everything that followed would be on him. The decision to move forward didn't come with a dramatic moment. No raised voices, no sudden confrontation, just a quiet shift from waiting to acting. The morning after my conversation with Jason, I called Richard Collins again. He answered on the first ring this time. I was hoping you'd call, he said. I gave him a chance, I replied simply. And he asked. He chose himself, I said. There was a brief silence on the line, not surprised, not disappointed, just acknowledgement. Then we proceed, Richard said calmly. Yes, I agreed, on our terms. The first step was clarity. Not emotional clarity, I already had that. Legal clarity. That afternoon, Richard arranged for me to meet with a geriatric specialist. Not because I doubted myself, but because I understood exactly what Jason and Lauren were trying to build. A narrative. One where I was confused, forgetful, unable to manage my own affairs. And narratives, if left unchallenged, can become dangerous. The doctor's office was quiet, understated. The kind of place where time seemed to slow down just enough for people to feel comfortable. Dr. Elaine Porter greeted me with a warm, professional smile. Mrs. Myers, she said, extending her hand. It's nice to meet you. Please call me Sarah, I replied. She nodded. Of course, Sarah. The evaluation wasn't invasive. No trick questions, no pressure, just a series of conversations, memory checks, reasoning exercises, things that felt almost ordinary. But beneath the surface, I understood what it was doing, establishing truth, documenting it, protecting it. When we finished, Dr. Porter set her clipboard aside and looked at me directly. You're doing very well, she said. Your cognition is sharp, your memory is intact, and your decision-making is sound. I felt a quiet sense of relief, not because I had doubted myself, but because now it was undeniable. Written, verified, official. Richard, who had been waiting outside, joined us shortly after. Doctor, he said, would you be willing to provide formal documentation? Of course, she replied. I'll have it prepared by the end of the day. That was the second step. Evidence. Not just what I knew, but what could be proven. The third step was preparation. not emotional, strategic. Over the next 2 days, Richard and I worked through every detail: cease and desist documents, formal notices outlining my legal standing, clear definitions of occupancy, what Jason and Lauren were allowed to do, and what they were not. Everything was precise, structured, unambiguous. There's no room for interpretation here. Richard said as he reviewed the final documents. Once these are presented, the situation changes immediately. I nodded. I understand. And you're ready for that, he asked. I considered the question carefully, because readiness isn't about being unafraid. It's about being certain. Yes, I said. Meanwhile, in the house, Jason and Lauren were making their own preparations. I could see it in the way they moved, the way conversations stopped when I entered the room, the way Lauren kept certain folders closer, now no longer leaving them openly on the counter. And then one evening, Jason approached me with a carefully neutral expression. "Hey, Mom," he said, "Lauren and I were thinking, maybe we could all sit down this weekend, just talk through some things. Future planning, stuff like that." I met his gaze. "Who else would be there?" I asked. He hesitated just slightly. Her parents, he admitted, and maybe a notary. Just to make things easier if we decide to move forward with anything, there it was, the setup. Carefully arranged, social pressure disguised as family support, a room full of people, documents ready, expectation built, and me, positioned as the one who needed to comply. I felt something inside me go very still. When I asked, "Sunday," he said, "late morning. We could do brunch, keep it relaxed." Relaxed. I almost smiled. "That sounds fine," I said. Relief flickered across his face. "Great," he said. "I think it'll be good for everyone." I nodded. "I'm sure it will." That night, I packed. Not everything, just what mattered. Personal items, important documents, things that held meaning beyond their physical form. Maggie came over to help. She moved quietly through the room, folding clothes, placing items into boxes with a care that felt almost reverent. "You're really doing this," she said softly at one point. "Yes," I replied. She looked at me for a long moment. "I'm proud of you," she said. The words settled into me more deeply than I expected, because for so long I had measured my worth by what I gave, what I endured, what I held together. But this was something different. This was about what I chose. By Saturday night, everything was in place. The documents were finalized, the evidence secured, the truth ready. I sat alone in my suite, the house quiet around me, and thought about everything that had led to this moment. The years of sacrifice, the gradual shift, the night at the dinner table, the word, burden, and the signature that followed. It hadn't been impulsive, it hadn't been emotional, it had been inevitable. Because once you see the truth clearly enough, there is only one direction you can go: forward. Sunday morning arrived with a strange sense of calm, the kind that doesn't come from comfort but from certainty. I dressed simply. Nothing formal, nothing that suggested anything out of the ordinary, just myself. When I stepped into the kitchen, Lauren was already there setting the table with practiced precision. "Good morning," she said, her tone light. "Good morning," I replied. Jason entered a few minutes later, glancing between us. "Everyone should be here soon," he said. I nodded. "I'll be ready." And I meant it, not just for the conversation they thought we were going to have, but for the one that was actually coming. Because while they believed they were preparing to guide me into a decision, I had already made mine. And this time, I wouldn't be the one being asked to sign. Sunday arrived dressed in politeness. That's the only way I can describe it. Everything about that morning was arranged to feel calm, reasonable, even loving. The table was set with soft linens, fresh fruit, warm pastries, and carefully brewed coffee. Lauren had chosen light colors for the setting whites and pale blues tones that suggested ease, clarity, trust. But beneath it all, there was something else: expectation. I walked into the dining area a few minutes before the guests arrived. Jason was adjusting the chairs, straightening them, as if the angle of each one might somehow influence the outcome of the day. "Morning, Mom," he said, offering a quick smile. "Good morning," I replied. Lauren glanced at me from the kitchen. "You look nice," she said, her tone smooth. "Thank you," I said. We stood in silence after that, 3 people sharing a space that no longer felt shared. The doorbell rang at exactly 10:30. Lauren moved quickly to answer it. Her parents entered first, George and Patricia Collins. George was a quiet man, reserved, the kind who spoke only when necessary. Patricia, on the other hand, carried herself with the quiet authority of someone who believed she understood how things should be done and expected others to agree. Sarah, Patricia said, offering a polite smile. "It's been a while, it has," I replied. We exchanged brief greetings, the kind that skim the surface without touching anything real. A few minutes later, another knock. This time, Jason opened the door. A man stepped inside, mid-50s, dressed in a neutral suit, carrying a leather briefcase. "This is Daniel Foster," Jason said. "He's just here to help with documentation, a notary." "Of course." Daniel nodded politely. "Nice to meet you, Mrs. Myers." "You too," I said. He took a seat at the far end of the table, placing his briefcase beside him. Everything was in place. Everyone seated. The stage set. Lauren began with small talk, weather, traffic, a recent event in the neighborhood. It was all very normal, very controlled, but I could feel it the moment approaching, like a shift in pressure before a storm. Jason cleared his throat after a few minutes. So we began glancing briefly at Lauren. We thought it might be a good idea to talk about some future planning. There it was. Patricia nodded approvingly. "It's important to think ahead," she said, "especially at this stage of life." I didn't respond. I simply listened. Lauren reached for a folder beside her plate and opened it carefully. "We've put together some information," she said. "Just options, nothing final." She slid a set of documents across the table toward me. "Things to help ensure you're protected," she added. "Protected." I looked down at the papers. Even without reading them fully, I recognized the structure. Medical authorization, financial power of attorney, residential transition agreements, everything they needed to take control, wrapped in language that sounded responsible, caring, necessary. Jason leaned forward slightly. "We're not asking you to decide anything right now," he said. "Just consider it. Talk it through with us." "With all of you," Lauren added. I let my fingers rest lightly on the edge of the documents. Then I looked up. At what point, I asked calmly, "Did this become something you planned without me?" The question landed quietly, but it changed the room. Jason shifted in his seat. "That's not what this is," he said. "Then explain it to me," I replied. Lauren spoke next, her tone measured. "We're trying to make things easier," she said. "For everyone." "For everyone," I repeated softly. Patricia leaned forward slightly. "Sarah, dear," she said, "this is about ensuring that your needs are met without unnecessary complications. It's responsible planning." I met her gaze. "My needs," I said. "Or your expectations?" The room went still. Jason exhaled sharply. "Mom, you're making this more difficult than it needs to be." "Am I?" I asked. Lauren's composure tightened. "We're offering support," she said. "Structure, security. By taking control," I said calmly. "No," Jason insisted. "By helping manage things before they become a problem." "And who decides when I become a problem?" I asked. No one answered, because there was no answer that didn't reveal the truth. I let the silence settle. Then I did something none of them expected. I closed the folder, not angrily, not dramatically, just decisively. "I won't be signing these," I said. Jason's expression hardened. "Mom, I'm not finished," I said gently. He stopped. I reached into my bag and removed a different folder, one that they had not prepared, one they had not anticipated. "I invited someone as well," I said. Jason frowned. What, right on cue, the doorbell rang. Lauren's head turned sharply toward the hallway. "I'll get it," she said quickly. She stood, her movements no longer smooth, and walked to the door. A moment later, she returned, with Richard Collins. He stepped into the room with quiet confidence, carrying a leather portfolio. "Good morning," he said. Jason's face went pale. "Richard?" he asked. "Yes," Richard replied calmly. "I believe Sarah asked me to join." Lauren's eyes narrowed. "We weren't informed," she said. Richard offered a polite smile. "And yet, here I am." He took a seat beside me, placing his portfolio on the table. The dynamic in the room shifted instantly. Control, something Jason and Lauren had carefully constructed, began to slip. "What is this?" Jason asked, his voice tight. This, I said quietly, is the rest of the conversation. Richard opened his portfolio and removed a set of documents. Not proposals, not suggestions, declarations. Before we proceed, Richard said, his tone measured, professional. It's important that everyone understands the current legal standing of this property and Mrs. Meyer's assets. Jason stared at him. What are you talking about? He demanded. Richard met his gaze calmly. I'm talking about ownership, he said. The word echoed through the room. Lauren leaned forward, her voice sharp. This is unnecessary, she said. We're just trying to know, I said gently. You were trying to proceed without all the information. Silence. Richard placed the documents on the table and slid them forward. These are certified copies of the trust established earlier this week, he said. Jason didn't move. Lauren reached for the papers first. Her eyes scanned the page, then widened. This isn't right, she said. It's fully executed, Richard replied. Irrevocable. Jason grabbed the document from her hands, reading quickly. What does this mean? He asked, his voice rising. It means, Richard said calmly, that the property you currently reside in is held within a trust managed by Mrs. Myers. Jason's face went white and he pressed. And Richard continued, your right to occupy this property is conditional. It is not ownership. It is not entitlement. It is permission. The word landed harder than anything else. Permission. Lauren stood abruptly. This is ridiculous, she said. We live here. Yes, Richard replied, at Mrs. Meyer's discretion. Jason looked at me, his expression a mix of shock and disbelief. You did this? He asked. I met his gaze. I protected myself, I said. The room felt different now. No longer controlled, no longer predictable, because for the first time, they weren't the ones guiding the outcome. They were reacting to it, and they had no idea what was coming next. Silence has a way of revealing everything people try to hide. After Richard's words settled into the room, no one moved for a few seconds. Not Jason, not Lauren, not even Patricia, who had seemed so certain just moments before, because certainty disappears quickly when the ground beneath it shifts. This doesn't make sense, Jason said, finally, his voice strained. That house, this house, it was supposed to be ours. The hesitation in his words said more than the sentence itself. Supposed to be, not is, not ever was. I watched him carefully, not with anger, but with something far steadier, with whose permission I asked quietly. He looked at me, searching for something, maybe reassurance, maybe contradiction, but I didn't offer either. Lauren recovered first. Her posture straightened, her tone sharpened. You can't just change things like this without discussing it, she said. We live here. We've built our lives here. Richard didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Mrs. Myers has every legal right to make decisions regarding her property, he said. The trust was established properly, documented thoroughly, and is fully enforceable. Lauren's jaw tightened. This is manipulation, she said. You're turning this into something it doesn't need to be. I met her gaze. No, I said calmly. I'm finally seeing it for what it is. Jason ran his hands through his hair, pacing once before stopping again. So what does this mean? He asked, his voice unsteady now. You're just going to, kick us out? The word hung in the air, kick us out, as if the idea were unthinkable, as if it hadn't been quietly considered from the other direction for months. I haven't made that decision, I said. Yet. I didn't need to say the word out loud. They heard it anyway. Richard slid another set of documents forward. There are additional matters we need to address, he said. Lauren didn't sit this time. She remained standing, arms crossed, her expression defensive. What now? She asked. Richard opened the file. Unauthorized entry into Mrs. Meyer's private living space, he said. Documented. Jason froze. Lauren's expression flickered just for a moment. I don't know what you're talking about, she said quickly. Richard didn't respond to her denial. Instead, he continued. Third-party individuals entering without consent. Personal belongings accessed. Photographic documentation taken. Jason turned to Lauren. What is he talking about? He demanded. Lauren's voice rose slightly. I told you it was just an evaluation. Nothing serious. An evaluation of what he pressed. She hesitated. That was all it took. Of her living situation, she said finally. We needed to understand what options were available. For what? Jason asked, his voice tightening. Lauren exhaled sharply. For the future, she said. For when things change. I spoke then. You mean for when I become inconvenient, I said quietly. Her eyes snapped to mine. That's not what I said. It's what you meant, I replied. Jason looked between us, his confusion deepening. You didn't tell me about this, he said to her. Lauren's composure cracked further. I didn't think it mattered yet, she said. We were just preparing. Preparing, always that word. Richard placed another document on the table. There was also evidence of attempts to initiate medical intervention without Mrs. Meyer's informed consent, he said. Jason's head turned sharply. What he said? Lauren shook her head immediately. That's not true. Appointment records have been located, Richard continued. Consultations scheduled under Mrs. Meyer's name with assisted living facilities. Jason stared at her. Lauren, he said slowly, is that true? She didn't answer right away, and in that silence, the truth settled. I was trying to help, she said, finally, her voice strained. You said yourself things were getting complicated. We needed a plan. Jason stepped back slightly as if the distance might help him process what he was hearing. This isn't what we talked about, he said. No, I said gently. It's what you didn't talk about. The room felt smaller now, tighter. Every word closing in on the reality none of them had wanted to face. Richard's voice cut through the tension again, calm, precise. Any further attempts to act on behalf of Mrs. Myers without her explicit consent will be considered legal violations, he said, including coercion, misrepresentation, and undue influence. Lauren's frustration turned to anger. So what we're just supposed to do, nothing, she snapped. Let everything fall apart. I looked at her. Whose everything, I asked. She didn't answer, because the answer was obvious. Not mine. Jason spoke then, his voice quieter than before. What about the financial support, he asked, almost cautiously. The help you've been giving, is that still no? I said. The word was simple. Final. It echoed more loudly than anything else that had been said. Jason blinked. What do you mean, no, he asked. I said calmly, that ended the night of the dinner. His face drained of color. You can't just, he started, then stopped. I held his gaze. I already did. Lauren let out a short, incredulous laugh. So that's it, she said. You cut us off and expect everything to just, work itself out. No, I said. I expect you to take responsibility for the life you chose. The words landed harder than any accusation, because they weren't emotional. They were factual. Jason sank slowly into his chair, his shoulders heavy. This is going to ruin us, he said quietly. I felt something shift inside me, not sympathy, not exactly, but recognition. Because for the first time, he wasn't speaking from control. He was speaking from consequence. I didn't ruin anything, I said softly. I stopped holding it together. The truth of that statement filled the room. Lauren turned away, pacing once across the floor. This is unbelievable, she muttered. After everything we've done, I stopped her gently. No, I said, after everything I've done. She froze. Because she couldn't argue with that. Jason looked up at me, then his expression stripped of its earlier certainty. What happens now, he asked. It was the same question he had asked before, but this time, it meant something different, because now he understood that the answer didn't belong to him. I took a slow breath. Now I said you decide who you want to be without what I provided. The room fell silent again. But this silence was different, heavier, more real, because for the first time there was nothing left to hide behind. No assumptions, no expectations, no control, only truth, and the consequences that come with it. After that morning, the house felt like a place that no longer belonged to any of us, not in the way it had before. The illusion had been stripped away too completely, too quickly. There was no returning to polite routines, no pretending that what had been said and revealed could somehow be folded back into silence. Jason barely spoke for the rest of the day. Lauren moved through the house like a storm contained within walls. Sharp movements clipped words, doors closing just a little too hard. The tension between them was immediate, undeniable. Not loud at first, but building. I stayed in my suite, not hiding, just separate. Because for the first time since I had come to live there, I understood something clearly. This was not my home anymore. Not emotionally, and soon not physically either. The unraveling didn't take long. Within a week, the cracks that had always been there beneath Jason and Lauren's carefully maintained image began to show. Bills that had been delayed came due. Calls Jason had avoided became unavoidable. I could hear them through the walls sometimes, not every word, but enough. "You said this would work," Lauren's voice one evening, tight with frustration. "I said it could work," Jason replied. "Not that it was guaranteed." "Well, now what?" she snapped. "We don't have the buffer anymore." The buffer. I sat quietly in my chair, the words settling into me. That was what I had been. Not just a mother, not even just support. A buffer. Something that absorbed the impact of their choices. And now that I was no longer there to do that, everything was hitting them directly. Jason lost 2 clients that week. I didn't hear it from him. I heard it from the tone of his voice when he was on the phone, strained, apologetic, trying to maintain confidence that no longer felt natural. "Just a delay," he said once. "We can still close next quarter." But there was hesitation in his words. Doubt. And doubt is something clients can hear even when you try to hide it. Lauren's frustration grew sharper. She stopped pretending around me entirely. There were no more polite smiles, no more carefully measured words. If anything, she avoided me completely, as if my presence itself reminded her of something she didn't want to face. Jason, on the other hand, he became quieter, more withdrawn, and then one evening he came to my door. I was sitting by the window when I heard the knock, soft, hesitant. "Mom." I didn't answer immediately, not because I didn't want to, but because I needed a moment to prepare myself. Then I stood and opened the door. Jason looked different. Not just tired, worn. There's a difference. Tired can be fixed with rest. Worn comes from something deeper. "Can we talk?" he asked. I stepped aside. He entered slowly, glancing around the room as if seeing it for the first time. Or perhaps seeing it differently. He sat down in the chair across from me, his hands clasped loosely together. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he exhaled. "I messed up," he said. The words were simple, but they carried weight. I didn't respond right away. I let him continue. "I thought I had everything under control," he said. "The business, the house, the finances. I thought if I just kept pushing, things would fall into place." He looked up at me. "But they didn't," he added quietly. I nodded. "I can see that," I said. He swallowed his gaze, dropping again, and instead of admitting that he continued, I started shifting things. Looking for ways to fix it without actually facing it. I watched him carefully. "By using me," I said. He flinched. "Yes," he admitted. The honesty was new, uncomfortable but real. "I didn't see it that way at first," he said. "I told myself it was temporary, that I'd make it up to you later, that once things stabilized, everything would go back to normal." I tilted my head slightly. "And what is normal, Jason?" I asked. He hesitated, then shook his head. "I don't even know anymore," he said. Silence settled between us again, but this time it wasn't tense. It was open. "I heard you talking," I said after a moment. He looked up. When he asked, "The other day," I replied, "about the medical authorization, about the house." His expression tightened. "I didn't mean for it to sound like that," he said. "But it did." I said gently. He nodded. "Yes." Another pause. Then more quietly, I was scared. The words surprised me, not because they were unexpected, but because he said them at all, of what I asked. He looked at me, his eyes clearer now than they had been in a long time. "Of failing," he said, "of losing everything I built, of looking like I couldn't handle my own life." I listened. And somehow, he continued. "It became easier to think of you as part of the problem, instead of admitting that I was." The honesty in that moment was almost painful, because it came too late to undo what had already been done. But it mattered. "I didn't want to be the one who needed help," he said, "so I made you the one who did." I felt something shift inside me, not forgiveness, not yet, but understanding. And understanding sometimes is the first step towards something else. "You called me a burden," I said quietly. He closed his eyes for a moment. "I know," he said. And you meant it, I added. He didn't argue, because he couldn't. I was wrong, he said. Yes, I replied. The word wasn't harsh. It didn't need to be. Truth rarely does. He looked at me again, his expression softer, now more vulnerable. I don't expect you to fix this, he said, or to help financially. I know I don't deserve that. That too was new, because for the first time, he wasn't asking. I needed you to hear it from me, he continued, that I see it now, what I did, how I treated you. I held his gaze. And what you intended to do, I said. He swallowed. Yes, the room felt very still, very honest. And then he said the words I had been waiting for, not because I needed them, but because they mattered. I'm sorry, he said. Not quickly, not defensively, but fully, completely. I took a slow breath. Because apologies don't erase actions, but they do reveal something important. Whether someone is willing to face what they've done. I believe you're sorry, I said. Relief flickered in his eyes, but I continued. That doesn't change what happened, I added. The relief faded, but he nodded. I know, he said. And it doesn't mean things go back to the way they were, I said. I understand, he replied. I studied him for a moment, then I said the only thing that felt honest. I can't give you what you're asking for, I said. He frowned slightly. I'm not asking for anything, he said. Not out loud, I replied. He looked down, because he knew I was right. But I can give you something else, I said. He looked up again, what he asked. Time, I said. He blinked. To prove I continued that what you're saying now isn't just a reaction to consequences. His expression softened. That's fair, he said. In truth, I added, no more hiding, no more planning around me. If there's going to be any kind of relationship between us, it has to be built on that. He nodded slowly. I can do that, he said. I didn't respond immediately, because promises are easy. Change is not. We'll see, I said finally. It wasn't rejection, but it wasn't acceptance either. It was something in between, something real. And as he stood to leave, I realized something quietly but with certainty. This was the first honest conversation we had had in years. Not because everything was fixed, but because nothing was being hidden anymore. And sometimes, that's where healing begins. I didn't leave the house immediately, not because I couldn't, but because I wanted to leave on my own terms fully, clearly, without anything unfinished lingering behind me. There's a difference between walking away in reaction and stepping forward with intention. I had spent too many years reacting, adjusting, accommodating. This time I wanted every step to be deliberate, so I gave myself time. Not for Jason, not for Lauren, but for me. The days after our conversation settled into a strange kind of quiet. Jason kept his distance, but not in avoidance, in respect, or at least an attempt at it. He no longer entered my space without knocking. He no longer spoke about finances in vague, suggestive terms around me. If anything, he spoke less altogether, as if he were learning how to exist, without filling every silence with control. Lauren, on the other hand, changed in a different way. She became distant. Not confrontational anymore, not sharp, but closed. There were no more attempts at conversation, no more subtle negotiations disguised as concern. She moved through the house as if I were no longer part of the equation, and perhaps in her mind, I wasn't. The tension between her and Jason, however, became impossible to ignore. I heard it in fragments at first, short exchanges, clipped sentences, then longer conversations late at night, their voices carrying through the walls. "This is your fault," Lauren said one evening, her voice low but intense. "My fault," Jason replied. "You're the one who pushed for all of this." "I pushed because you were too afraid to act," she snapped. "We needed a plan." "We had a plan," he said. "We just didn't think she'd do this." "Because you underestimated her," Lauren shot back. There was a pause. Then more quietly, "We both did." I sat in my chair listening, not with satisfaction, not with resentment, but with a kind of clarity that comes when you're no longer emotionally entangled in the outcome. Because whatever they were facing now, it was theirs, not mine. 3 days later, I called Maggie. "I'm ready," I told her. She didn't ask what I meant. She already knew. "I'll come by," she said. That afternoon, we packed the rest of my belongings. Not everything, just what mattered. The rest could stay. Furniture, decorations, things that had never truly felt like mine. I had come into that house with memories and meaning, not possessions, and that's what I was taking with me. Jason came home while we were still packing. He stood in the doorway of my suite for a long moment, taking in the half-empty space, the boxes neatly arranged, the absence of things that had once filled the room. "You're leaving," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," I replied. He nodded slowly as if he had expected it, but still needed to hear it, when he asked. "Tomorrow morning," I said. He stepped inside, glancing at Maggie briefly before focusing on me again. "Can I help?" he asked. The question surprised me, not because of the offer itself, but because of the way he asked it, carefully, without assumption. I shook my head gently. "We've got it covered," I said. He nodded again, accepting the answer without argument. "Okay," he said. He lingered for a moment, then added, "I'll be here if you need anything," and then he left. It was a small moment, but it meant something, because for the first time he wasn't trying to control the situation. He was simply present. That night, I slept better than I had in months, not because everything was resolved, but because I knew I was moving forward. And there's a kind of peace that comes with that quiet, steady, undeniable. The next morning, the house felt different. Not tense, not heavy, just finished. Maggie arrived early, and together we carried the last of my things out to the car. Jason stood by the front door watching. Lauren was nowhere to be seen. I didn't ask where she was. It didn't matter. When everything was loaded, I turned back toward the house. For a moment, I simply looked at it. The place that had once felt like a solution, then a compromise, then something else entirely. "Mom," Jason said softly. I turned to him. He stepped forward slightly, his hands at his sides, his posture uncertain. "I'm glad you're doing this," he said. The words caught me off guard. Why, I asked. He hesitated, then said, "Because you deserve to have your own space again, your own life." I studied him carefully. "And you?" I asked. He gave a small, tired smile. "I'll figure it out," he said. For the first time, I believed him, not because he had everything under control, but because he no longer pretended that he did. I nodded. "I hope you do," I said. There was a pause. Then he stepped forward and did something he hadn't done in a long time. He hugged me, not out of obligation, not out of habit, but because he wanted to. I stood there for a moment, surprised by the simplicity of it. Then I returned the gesture. Not because everything was forgiven, but because something had changed. And that mattered. When he stepped back, his eyes were clearer than I had seen them in years. "Take care of yourself," he said. "You too," I replied. And then I turned and walked away. My condo felt exactly the same as I had left it. The familiar creak of the floorboards, the soft light through the kitchen window, the quiet that belonged to me and no one else. I stood in the doorway for a moment, taking it all in, home, not because of the space, but because of the freedom it held. Maggie set the boxes down and smiled. "Welcome back," she said. I smiled too. "Thank you," I replied. The weeks that followed were different, not dramatic, not filled with sudden transformation, but steady, intentional. I reconnected with people I hadn't seen in years, neighbors, friends, members of my church community. I volunteered at a local center that helped older women understand their financial rights, their legal protections, their ability to make choices for themselves. I told my story, not in detail, not with bitterness, but with honesty. And I saw something in their eyes when I did, recognition. Because more of us had lived through something similar than we were willing to admit. Jason reached out occasionally, a message, a call, nothing demanding, nothing expectant, just contact. I didn't rush to respond, but I didn't ignore him either, because what we had now wasn't what we used to have, and it wasn't something that could be rebuilt quickly. It would take time, consistency, truth. But for the first time, that felt possible. One afternoon, as I sat by my window watching the sunlight move across the floor, I realized something quietly but completely. I hadn't lost anything that truly belonged to me. Not my independence, not my dignity, not my ability to choose. If anything, I had finally reclaimed them, and that made all the difference. The first time Jason and I met again after I moved out, it wasn't planned far in advance. There was no build-up, no carefully chosen moment, just a simple message. Jason. Are you free for coffee sometime this week? No pressure? I stared at the text for a long time before responding, not because I didn't know what to say, but because I understood what it meant. This wasn't about fixing things quickly. This was about whether something new could begin. I replied the next morning. Me Thursday, 10 a.m. There's a cafe on Maple Street. His response came almost immediately. Jason, I'll be there. Thursday arrived quietly. The cafe was small, the kind of place that didn't try too hard to impress. Warm lighting, soft music, a few scattered tables filled with people minding their own lives. It felt neutral, safe in a way. I arrived a few minutes early and chose a table by the window. Old habits, I suppose. Jason walked in exactly on time. He looked different. Not in any dramatic way. No sudden transformation, but in the details. His clothes were simpler, his posture less rigid, his expression more open, though still uncertain. He saw me and paused for just a moment before walking over. Hi, he said. Hi, I replied. He sat down across from me, placing his phone face down on the table, something I noticed immediately. Jason had never done that before. Thanks for meeting me, he said. You asked, I replied. A server came by and we ordered coffee. For a few moments, we sat in silence, not uncomfortable but unfamiliar. Then Jason took a breath. I've been going to therapy, he said. The words surprised me, not because I didn't think he needed it, but because he chose to tell me. That's good, I said. He nodded. I didn't realize how much I was avoiding, he admitted. Not just the financial stuff. Everything. I listened. My sense of worth, he continued, was tied up in how things looked. The house, the business, the image. I thought if I could keep all of that intact, everything else would be okay. And when it wasn't, I asked. He gave a small, humorless smile. I panicked, he said, and instead of dealing with it, I started looking for ways to control it. I held his gaze. Even if that meant controlling me, I said. He nodded. Yes. There was no hesitation this time, no deflection, just truth. And Lauren, I asked. He looked down briefly. We're separated, he said. I absorbed that quietly. When I asked, a couple of weeks after you left, he replied, things fell apart pretty quickly. I didn't ask for details. I didn't need them. Do you blame her? I asked instead. He shook his head. No, he said. Not anymore. That answer mattered. Why not, I asked. Because I was part of it, he said. I let it happen. I agreed with things I shouldn't have. I stayed quiet when I should have spoken up. He looked at me again. That's on me. I nodded slowly. Yes, I said. The simplicity of that acknowledgement seemed to settle something between us. Our coffee arrived, then the warmth of the cups grounding the moment. Jason wrapped his hands around his mug, staring at it for a second before speaking again. I don't expect anything from you, he said. Not forgiveness, not help, not anything. I waited. I just wanted you to know that I understand now, he continued. What I did, what I almost did, the word almost lingered, because sometimes the things we don't complete still leave damage behind. I know you do, I said. He looked up surprised. You do? He asked. Yes, I replied, because you're not trying to explain it away anymore. He let out a slow breath. I spent a long time thinking I could fix everything if I just said the right things, he admitted. But that's not how this works. Is it? No, I said gently. It isn't. We sat in silence for a moment, both of us understanding that there were no shortcuts here, no quick resolutions, no easy answers. Can I ask you something, he said. You can ask. I replied. He hesitated, then said, do you think we can have a relationship again? The question was honest, uncertain, and for the first time, not rooted in expectation. I took a moment before answering, because this wasn't a question to respond to lightly. I don't think we can go back to what we had before, I said. His expression tightened slightly, but he nodded. I figured he said. That version of us, I continued, was built on things that aren't true anymore. He looked at me listening carefully, but I added, that doesn't mean we can't build something new. Hope flickered in his eyes, small, cautious. What would that look like, he asked. Time, I said. He nodded. Okay, consistency, I continued. Honesty. No more assumptions, no more planning around each other without actually talking. I can do that, he said. We'll see, I replied. It wasn't a rejection, but it wasn't a promise either. It was the only honest answer I could give. He accepted it. I understand, he said. We finished our coffee, slowly the conversation drifting to smaller things, his work, my volunteer efforts, the changes in our routines. Nothing heavy, nothing forced, just two people learning how to speak to each other again. When we stood to leave, there was no awkwardness, just a quiet understanding that something had shifted, not healed, not fixed, but begun. Thank you for coming, he said. Thank you for asking, I replied. He hesitated for a moment, then said, I'll call you next week. I nodded. I'll answer if I'm ready, I said. He smiled faintly. That's fair, and then we parted ways. That evening, I sat by my window, the same place where I had spent so many quiet mornings and long afternoons. The light was different, now softer, warmer. Or maybe it was just me. I thought about everything that had happened. The dinner, the word, burden, the document I signed, the truth it revealed, and the life that followed. I hadn't signed that document to punish my son. I hadn't signed it to prove a point. I signed it because for the first time I understood something clearly. Loving someone does not mean losing yourself, and protecting yourself does not mean you love them any less. If anything, it means you finally learned how to love in a way that doesn't disappear. Jason and I would never be who we used to be, but maybe, just maybe, we could become something more honest, something real. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough. There's a quiet truth many women, especially those of us who have spent decades caring for others, come to understand too late. We confuse endurance with love. We believe that if we just stay patient, stay kind, stay silent, things will eventually become right again, that our role is to hold the family together no matter the cost to ourselves. But the truth is, love without respect is not love. And silence, when it allows harm to continue, is not strength. It's surrender. Setting boundaries doesn't mean you are cruel. Protecting yourself doesn't mean you are selfish. And choosing your own dignity does not mean you have stopped loving your family. It means you have finally included yourself in that love. If there's one thing I hope you take from my story, it's this. You are not a burden for existing. You are not a burden for needing respect. And you are never a burden for choosing to protect your own life. If you've ever been in a situation where you had to choose between keeping the peace and standing up for yourself, I would truly love to hear your story. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. Your voice matters more than you think. And if this story spoke to you, if it made you feel seen, understood, or a little less alone, please take a moment to subscribe, and share your thoughts below. Because sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is remind each other that we are not alone.